I want to introduce our first panelist, Mary Robinson Cohen, our superintendent in residence. Mary is the former chief school administrator, superintendent, and principal of Roosevelt Public School District. And under her leadership, Roosevelt was ranked the #1 elementary district in Monmouth County by Niche Magazine. Next, we have Nancy Weinstein, CEO and founder of Mindprint Learning. She'll be providing an overview of the learning pyramid, and which will be a great segue over to Rachel Herman, who's visiting all the way from California from Learning for All. And she's here to provide a couple case studies of different students. Rachel is a professionally certified educational therapist. She's a dyslexia specialist, and she's the founder and executive director of Learning for All, which is an educational therapy and cognitive development specialty. She serves struggling learners of all ages in San Diego and around the world. And so welcome, everybody. I see some people in the chat saying where they're from. We appreciate that, so we can see where we're coming from all over the United States and possibly the world today.
Melissa,
So
can I just interrupt?
I think we're not seeing slides is what I'm
sorry.
We're seeing each other. Okay, so let me get onto that slide deck. All right. It probably would help if I shared the screen. That probably would help. All right. Are we on the housekeeping slide? Does everybody see that? Okay, so not just seeing each other. All right, great. So here's the agenda. We're going to kick it off with Mary Robinson Cohen, go over the learning pyramid and the case studies. It's what I think I just showed you guys or went over. So we'll start with reading defined. And so we've got a slide on just making sure that we're starting on the same page in terms of how we define reading and the core 5 pillars of reading. Mary, if you want to go ahead and kick us off. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you, Melissa. And thank you everyone for joining today and taking really a lot of time out of what I know is a very busy schedule. I just recently retired from my position, but before that I was a high school teacher. And I know for all of you what this is like to come back after a break, to come back after the pandemic. But certainly, I don't think there's any more important topic, right? We all want to figure out why aren't the children reading, which is the title today, because we know that reading underlies everything that students do, right? It underlies their math achievement, it underlies all subjects. So we really want to figure out what are the issues, right? So just so we are all on the same page, reading is the motivated and fluent coordination of word recognition and comprehension. The pillars are phonemic awareness, phonics instruction, fluency instruction, vocabulary instruction, comprehension instruction. And you all know that they're, it's controversial. So we go through phases in education and we sort of, emphasize one or the other. At this point, I think there's a big emphasis a lot of people are putting on the Orton-Gillingham method. Anyway, so what we're going to do today, though, is we're going to take a look at what impacts why the children aren't reading. And it's multivariable, right? If we had one solution, we would, bottle it up and that would be it. But we really know that it's multivariable. Thank you, Melissa. If you could go forward. Okay, so and what I'm going to talk about a little bit is bias. And you know what? People think that bias is a bad word. I always assume that everyone is approaching their job with the best intentions. We wouldn't be in this business, this difficult business of educating kids if we weren't. Okay, but having said that, all of our experience, we bring all of our own experiences to bear, and sometimes these impact what we're seeing. So when we think about reading, sometimes we say, oh, we have these observations and assumptions that it's okay, he's the youngest in the grade, he just needs more time. The old wives' tale, he's a boy, he's immature, or what birthday did he start? Did he start late? Did he start early? We've all been through that, right? In terms of holding kids back and then moving them forward based on the birthday lines. We might say she's shy, but she's fine. She just doesn't, in her family, they're not urged to speak up, and they're, it's better if they just take a back seat. Smart kid. It hasn't clicked yet. She'll get it. I hope these are resonating with you as we're going through. It's really kind of difficult not to see everybody who's here, but I hope that as you listen, you think, well, I might have thought that. I might have thought about it about my own child, right? I might have thought, and by the way, I think I'm just going to say, when we talk about our own children, I always start by saying that I am driven. My mission is that I want for all children what I wanted for my own children when they were being educated, right? And they had a fabulous education, and I want to be sure that every child has that opportunity. Anyway, sometimes we say, oh, I'm sure he has ADHD. The New York Times did a piece on Sunday about ADHD, identifying it. So now we'll have lots of other experts talking about ADHD when we know that that in fact is a medical diagnosis, right? Okay, so sometimes we say, oh, the parents aren't reading at home. And we know as teachers, we don't like to blame the parents, but sometimes we're like, oh, please, why don't they do more at home? ELL, English language learner, it'll take more time. Maybe they're thinking in another language or speaking another language at home. And of course, everybody is talking about COVID and the missed class, right? Because we know the NAEP studies have been released, and we know that we are really behind in terms of our progress. Not an excuse, though. We really have to close these gaps and fill in the gaps, right? Okay, Melissa, thank you. Where do these assumptions come from? Right? They come from our past experiences. We look at a child, and we do as teachers, we know, we say, oh, either we taught his brothers and sisters, so we know something about the family, or so-and-so reminds me just of that other student that I had, and I'm going to try to, and it's not wrong. We try to bring to the table what we use, what we know, right? So we bring our own learning, our own past experiences, and some of them are rooted in best practices, right? These are not negative. So we have to be careful when we think about bias, right? Melissa, please. We are not sure in terms of the best practices, right? The research on science of reading is evolving, and our PD in our schools hasn't always kept up. I'm a big proponent in, if you're bringing professional development to a staff, we need to really be as close to the source as possible. And I know that that's a problem sometimes financially, but I don't believe in watering it down and training the trainer. And you have this evolution where when you finally see what's happening and what you're teaching your professionals, that it doesn't bear any, it's like whispering down the lane. It doesn't bear any relation to what we've seen in terms of the real hardcore professional learning and best practices. I was fortunate as a teacher that I always had administrators who taught me that, who said, you know, if it's worth doing, I'm going to send you to it. And if it's really worth doing, hopefully you're going to be able to do it in the course of the day, instead of at the end of the day when we're all joining our PLCs and we're tired and we have to get the bus and we have to get our own kids. Anyway, observed behavior can have multiple root causes, right? So it's not just one quick fix. And adults and children's behavior changes because of technology. So these are some of our assumptions that we get into, but really underlying all of these is we need to really check ourselves and say, is something, am I being influenced? Instead of looking at the data that's in front of me, because certainly, as we know, we are data-driven in schools. That's the only thing really that matters. Go forward, please. And there we go. Data drives. If you can go back to the last, slide. Data should drive, not should. Data must drive the decisions, right? Data has to. Otherwise, we're really shooting in the dark. We have good intentions, but it may not fit the child that we see in front of us. So we've spent a lot of time in the past couple of years, you can go forward. We spent a lot of time in the past couple of years looking at the academic achievement data. And I know as teachers, we're overdone with all the, actually COVID gave us a little break because we were all in all of our states. We were looking at the academic achievement and we were data driven. And sometimes it really actually had a negative effect on our own personal careers because we were tied to this data. And I think most of the states have backed off in that category at this point, but that's not to say that academic achievement isn't very important. We know when we're talking about reading, early intervention is absolutely critical, right? We know in schools, and honestly, as I shared with you, I was a high school teacher. So when I led a school that was an elementary school, I really had to go and learn how do children learn to read? How can I observe my teachers? Do I know if they're doing a good job in terms of teaching reading? And and believe me, I have the utmost respect for the teachers of young children who really take these children at a time when their brains are as we say here, malleable, and the neural connections are forming. And teachers really, and I always say that to teachers, I always say, you know what? I used to say to my own children's teachers when they taught them as young children, that it's just amazing to watch what you're doing. So I do salute you. But I took a class. I did take a long-term class in the Orton-Gillingham method so that I would understand what teaching reading looked like. If you could go forward. All right, so and go forward again, please. So when we look at the whole child, right? So we have this academic data, right? And we know that we're looking at when teachers are evaluating reading, they're looking at rapid naming, nonsense words, oral fluency, words per minute, reading comprehensions. Everybody uses different tests to derive that information. And as well, we use formative assessments and informal assessments and summative assessments to really gather that academic data. More recently, we have started to look at the social and emotional data, right? That wasn't always so. I do say, and here's where I salute our special education teachers and our child study team members, because they've always worked in terms of fusing the academic data with the social and emotional data, right? So, and they haven't always gotten the props that they deserve for that, but they certainly have always, and as a school leader, I relied on those teams to help me triangulate or to mix those two data sets, right? To understand what's the motivation, what might be going on, is there effort, is there frustration, what's the mindset? What's going on at home? Is there reading at home? Certainly reading at home has been it's been a little controversial. I was very influenced by the work that Richard Rothstein did on reading and what happens in a child's background. Pedro Noguera has countered that a little bit because I think he thought that Rothstein's data allowed schools to take their foot off the gas and say, oh, well, it's what's going on at home. So we know that all of these things are important. So here's what we're going to talk about a little bit about today, right? There's a third piece, and wouldn't we want to have all of the data, right? And the third piece is cognitive data. What helps children learn best, right? And I know that Nancy Weinstein's going to talk a little bit about that in a second, but we now have these three important data sets. Why wouldn't we use everything we know? In my own work, I did use cognitive data, not in the reading arena, but I used it actually, I used it as a gifted screener because I found that I could then cut through and I could look at equity issues in terms of when I looked at screening for gifted, because I knew that my equity issues were based on implicit bias. I knew that there were issues in teachers making assumptions, as I said, always assume good assumptions, but making assumptions about a child that weren't always so, that they were implicit bias. So I needed a really data-driven best practice to be able to use my screening in the gifted arena. But certainly we're going to talk about it today in terms of how we can use it for reading. And I am at this point going to turn it over to Nancy, who explains it best.
Oh, I don't know about that. That was wonderful, Mary. Thank you. And so I think what is important, and I saw it sort of flip up in the chat, was someone expressing a concern about not having great data all the time. And I think that's completely fair. I think oftentimes you can at least look at trend data, and then by triangulating the data, when all three measures of the cognitive, social, emotional, and academic, when they align, then I think you can feel really good about your data, right? And then if they're misaligned, then it gives you the opportunity to say, maybe this isn't all good data. What is the piece that maybe should be repeated or dug in deeper? And part of what we hope we can do with you and support you in Mindprint is looking at those skills that are perhaps underlying and driving why a student might not be succeeding as rapidly in their reading. So in Mary's earlier slide about early intervention, the brain is so malleable at these young ages. And so if we can see that a student has some markers for where they might likely be struggling in reading, and that it might not just be give them more time, or they're the youngest in the grade, or there's not enough reading at home, but rather there is an underlying skill that might impede their growth, being able to identify that early can make that child's journey so much easier. And I think that's what we hope we can support you with, as well as the path along that journey. So in all of our Mindprint training sessions, we always start with the learning pyramid, because these are the cognitive skills that we're talking about when we use the word cognitive. And if this is unfamiliar to you, please, we've done past presentations. Last month's webinar, we went through this pyramid in detail, so we're not going to go through it today, but just to say there are 9 skills that we're really focusing on that drive all of learning. At the very foundation is understanding new important information, and those are our complex reasoning skills. That is not enough to be able to learn and master. You need to be able to focus and apply it, and so those are our executive functions. We have students who can understand and apply and won't retain unless we give them that reinforcement. Knowing that is so important, to give them the strategies for that. And then finally, when we want to go to deeper learning and really and problem solving, there's this skill, flexible thinking, that crosses between the executive function and complex reasoning domains. And that's really where you do your creative problem solving. So that was a past lesson. We're happy to go through it deeper, but now we're going to talk specifically about reading today, and really just highlighting the parts of the pyramid that are most specific to identifying which students do need a little bit more intervention with a more specific program, versus maybe there are students that just need more time, and they are the youngest in their grade, and we want to give them that time without feeling rushed. But we also want to be able to identify the markers that might suggest it's not just going to be time that's going to solve this challenge, and we need to really dig in deeper and make sure we're supporting that student early, when the brain is the most malleable, right? So I'm just highlighting, it's not to say that all these skills are not important, and most of the pyramid is highlighted. Reading is fundamental, but I'm just going to quickly try and go through the skills that we see can be the biggest impact. And if you see a lower skill on a Mindprint profile, that might be where you want to dig in. So the first is verbal reasoning. That's that skill that basically enables you to connect words and make meaning of them. And if you see a student with lower verbal reasoning, they're probably going to struggle a little bit with reading comprehension, right? If they can't do short analogies, then doing long sentences and long paragraphs and tying ideas together is going to be a challenge, and they might need structured reading intervention. But I also want to take this opportunity to dispel a myth that if you see a student with strong verbal reasoning, that they might not have a reading challenge. And that's not true. And I know Rachel will go into it more, but you can have strong verbal reasoning and understand ideas and still struggle with reading fluency. And those are students that worry me, because they're often missed, because people think they can't have a reading challenge because they are so bright. And that's really, you want to understand that that's not the only skill that you can look at and say, this is fine, so everything's fine, and we just need to give more time. The next set of skills are executive function skills. Executive functions and reading challenges are often, first of all, in some students, they happen together, so they're overlapping. And sometimes what looks like a challenge with attention and executive functions is really a reading challenge. So you need to be careful. And that's when you start triangulating the data, right? So if you see a low number on attention or working memory or very slow processing speed, yes, it might be executive functions, but then we really want to dig in more carefully and closely with that reading data and make sure that there aren't some signals in that data as well to make sure that we're not missing anything. And we see it all the time where students, they're like middle school, high school, they've been diagnosed with ADHD, and what they're really struggling with is a reading challenge. And so again, data triangulation. And then at the top of, not the top, but the top we're going to discuss today are our memory skills. So the reason what we see oftentimes is that there is a pattern in students who will have a diagnosis for a reading challenge. And what you'll commonly see is not that they necessarily have a weak memory skill, but you'll see this differential between visual memory and verbal memory. So your ability to remember pictures, and I want to specify pictures here, right, versus your ability to remember words. So it's not that a memory skill alone is a signal, but that differential does suggest that a student, in combination with other factors, might be having a challenge. So if you haven't figured it out yet, there's a reason the kids aren't reading. It's complicated. It's not just one thing. And so you really do need to have multi sources of data and triangulate them and have someone really bright and capable like a Mary or a Rachel to sort of help you solve those problems. But the one factor to look at, if you see sometimes some of our brightest students have this really strong differential between very, very high visual memory and maybe average or below average verbal memory. Those are students who memorize their way through it and they fool us. And we think that they're reading and really they don't have the phonological awareness and they've memorized words and they're missed by the system. And again, I want to give that flag and then hand it over to Rachel to make everything that I'm saying that's kind of a little bit abstract and put it into really specific examples of where she's seen it in students and how to support them.
Thanks, Nancy. Thank you so much. It's such a privilege to be here. And as an educational therapist in clinical practice, this whole idea of identifying all of the areas of need of a learner and developing a plan that's specific to all of those areas of need is my world. And so it's exciting to be able to be on a panel with educators who want to be able to bring that data and those ideas and make them more accessible to teachers in a classroom setting. And I think there's so much power to be had there. So I want to share a couple of case studies. And as Nancy said, no matter when we get a learner, at what age or what process, or even what profile a learner comes to us with presenting concerns, we're always going to check that reading data, because oftentimes, especially in older learners who have developed coping skills to kind of get through their school process, those coping skills can often mask a reading deficit. And so so it's really important, as we've been discussing, to look at the whole learner. And so we're going to look at two different case studies today. Both of these are older learners. So just one more connection to what we've been talking about in terms of early intervention and early identification. That absolutely is the gold standard. Those of us who come from, the science of reading community and the structured literacy community are pushing for universal screening in K-2 for reading for all students, because when we can identify those factors early on that are impacting challenges with reading, we can oftentimes keep learners out of special education. We can oftentimes have, a much more efficient process to remediate those learners. Oftentimes when we get learners in our clinic, it's third grade and above. Because especially in our bright learners, and this is why the cognitive data is so important, because we can see these really strong cognitive skills, those learners are the ones who develop the best coping, mask their reading skills most effectively, and are the latest to be identified. And so we often get learners, our most common profile for dyslexia is to get a learner either in the 3rd or 4th grade who has been able to memorize words up until kind of that end of 2nd grade. In 3rd grade, we're kind of transitioning from teaching reading to depending on reading for learning. So we're not learning to read anymore. It's said we're now reading to learn. But our learners who are struggling readers are not able to do that. They're not able to learn from the text if they're not effective and fluent readers. And so we're going to look at a couple of case studies today of older learners who were missed in the system for a long time. And this really ties into what Mary was talking about, those biases and how those biases and assumptions impact learners down the road in their process and oftentimes prevent them from getting the intervention that they need. So first, we're going to talk about Nellie, and these are actually 2 real case studies, but some of the details and the names have been changed so that we don't have specific identifying characteristics, but these are real profiles of real learners. So Nellie is a 12-year-old female in 6th grade. She's been in private school her entire career with support. Her learning difficulties were identified early on. And in this particular learner, because of her sensory processing disorder and because of apraxia, which is difficulty with speech and motor control of the mouth, her learning challenges were very obvious, and especially her very slow processing speed. So it showed up for her not only in mental processing functions, but also in her motor processing. And so it was very obvious. A lot of learners who have slow processing speed don't have that motor component. And so it's much harder to identify. But this learner did have that. And with the sensory processing, struggles with balance and some other things that, that were more evident, physically evident, but a history of reading difficulties. So that's kind of the profile. First, I want to look at the academic data because that is what we tend to have a lot of in schools. We have a lot of academic data. We have a lot of, percentile scores. We have, longitudinal data for, a student, standardized testing year over year. So we can see trajectories and we can see trends in the academic data. But the academic data is limited with respect to the fact that it only gives us a picture of the student's ability for specific skills. It doesn't tell us the why. So if a learner's percentages are low or they're struggling in some way, we can see that clearly in the academic data. We can see the trend. But if that's the only piece we're looking at, we don't know why that student is struggling. And that's where the cognitive data and the social emotional data becomes so vital because they help reveal the why of that learner's challenges. So let's look at the academic profile for this student specific to reading. Nonsense word reading score was at 30%. Any learner in 2nd grade and above, we are at 2nd grade and above, we want them to be at 80% for those nonsense words. 3rd grade and above, 90% for those nonsense words. So that's significantly below. Real words at the 4th grade level. So that is 2 grade levels below her school grade level. And these are real words without context. So identifying, just recognizing real words. Some are decodable, some are not in a traditional way. Then we looked at an oral reading fluency score, 71 words per minute with 80% accuracy. So that's in the intensive intervention range, or what we used to call well below benchmark, in both the reading speed and in accuracy. And those are the 2 components of fluency. We have to have a requisite reading speed along with a requisite amount of accuracy in order for us to be able to achieve fluent reading and therefore comprehension. So spelling at a 3.9 grade level. So that's the academic data. That would suggest significant delays. When we go over to the cognitive data, though, and we used Mindprint to gather this data, we'll look at that slide in just a second. We noticed significant strengths in visual memory, working memory, abstract reasoning, and attention, with areas to support in spatial perception, verbal memory, and processing speed. And when we get to that mind print slide in a minute, I'll share a little bit more. I should have gone in the other order, but we'll see there's significant differential, significant discrepancy between scores. So when we see high cognitive pieces along with low cognitive pieces, we know that suggests very often that something is going on with processing. So that's not the only way we identify a processing disability, but that's one of the primary markers. Big differentials in those cognitive scores suggest something is going on, not with global intelligence, right, but with specific areas of processing. And as Mary said, it's so exciting to be an educator in this time when we're really starting to take into account the social emotional component of a learner's background in identifying their needs and developing a plan. So this is a learner with exceptional family support. We know very strong home life, lots of integrity in the process, of getting interventions that were needed. So we know that wasn't a factor in this learner's development, and that is a factor in a lot of the learners that we work with, but not in this case, but extremely slow processing historically, and so therefore needing a lot of extra time to synthesize information. That's something that's very difficult in a traditional classroom for learners, because there's a pace of the class, there's a group that's going on, and oftentimes our learners with slow processing get left behind because they aren't given enough think time in the process to be able to synthesize the information that's coming at them. Looking at the profiles here, then you'll notice, as I pointed out, we have this strong visual memory, right, in the upper 16th percentile as a huge strength. And along with that, in the lower 16th percentile, spatial perception. So these are really extreme differentials in scores. This information is something that we can use to help us with remediation. Strong visual memory, strong working memory, and actually what's in that expected range, that flexible thinking and abstract reasoning, is something that functionally this student was able to use really effectively. And so we know, again, it's not an issue of intelligence, it's really an issue of processing. So when we look at the plan and the intervention process for a learner like this, we're looking at several things. First of all, we're going to be applying an Orton-Gillingham-based program that covers all 5 of those pillars of reading, starting with phonological processing and phonemic awareness, then phonics, vocabulary, fluency, and comprehension. We have to get to comprehension. That's the goal of reading. But when a learner struggles with language-based processing, they have to get to comprehension through the pathway of those other 4 pillars. That is essential. So for this learner, that is 2 to 3 sessions a week. Those are one-on-one sessions over 3 to 4 years to get all the way through to a high school level of language. For this learner, she is going to need extra fluency practice because of that slow processing speed. So we really had to go a little bit slower through that Orton-Gillingham process to focus on fluency at every step so that she could start to internalize that process. And it's that internalization of the process of reading, bringing that inside, that allows processing speed to increase, along with other cognitive skill building protocols that specifically address processing speed. Handwriting Without Tears is another piece that we use. The reading comprehension program then comes later in the process. And then cognitive integration techniques specific to what we saw on that mind print, those cognitive areas that we need to focus on: processing speed, auditory memory, also called verbal memory, and spatial reasoning skills. For this learner, and this also could kind of go on the strategy slide that we're going to look at next, we want her to be working with audiobooks at her intellectual level, not her reading level. She is a bright learner, full of wonderful ideas, but the amount of information that she's able to read and synthesize as opposed to what she's able to listen to and synthesize, there's a discrepancy there. So we want her to have access to audiobooks at a high cognitive level so she can have access to information even as we're building up that reading skill and helping it to increase over time. Typing is another important skill for her, especially any learner that has motor challenges or spelling issues related to a language-based processing challenge will benefit from typing. And finally, OT for sensory integration. So we'll take a look at the strategies now, and these are some of the tools that come with a Mindprint profile that are really helpful. We can look at, and I'm not going to go over all of these in depth for the sake of time, but we can look at how could we use our stronger visual reasoning skills. And for learners who struggle with this, it's really about being able to visualize what they read or be able to turn that language into a mental movie or a mental picture. That's how we know comprehension has been achieved. And then I might have that learner give back to me what they're seeing. What is this scene that they've created based on what they read? And this oftentimes will reveal where missing pieces are in terms of understanding of language. So visual reasoning, visual memory, and pacing yourself on tests. And here's where accommodations come in for this kind of learner. This learner is going to need extra time for testing. This learner is going to need a separate testing environment where she can take breaks, where she can ask clarifying questions, not to get the answer, but to make sure she understands the question so that we know that we're testing not her reading level, but her ability to answer a question about history or a question about science. And so for her to be able to ask those clarifying questions to make sure she understands what she's being tested on is a vital piece. So that's Nellie, and we're going to take a look at another learner. This is Grace. She's also an older learner, and again, another learner where some of those biases and assumptions really impacted her early in life, and also where her social emotional issues really impacted her development. So she's a 17-year-old high school senior. She is now attending a non-traditional school. She's not ready yet for community college. So even though she will graduate, she needs to focus on underlying skills so that she could be ready to enter a community college setting. Long history of learning challenges, early diagnosis of APD, auditory processing disorder, along with dyslexia, and a long history of low motivation for learning. We can look to some of the social emotional pieces of this data for those antecedents. In foster care until 4th grade, but then adopted by a family who had placed a very high value on education, athletic, but as a part of a friend group and a culture at school who does not place a high value on education. This is a learner that has kind of been caught in the middle for a lot of her academic career between her social and cultural group and between her family setting, her adoptive family setting, which was, of course, a later part of her life. If we look at the academic data, lower than Nellie, nonsense words at 15%, reading at a 4th grade level, but as a 17-year-old, extremely low oral reading fluency. And this was only an 8th grade passage as opposed to, a 12th grade passage. Poor vocabulary and writing skills and poor executive functioning. So Nancy talked a little bit about executive functioning and poor executive functioning. We get a lot of families who come to us with middle and high school students that want us to work on executive functioning. But what parents often don't realize is those executive functioning challenges in middle and high school have an antecedent in a specific learning disability, in a processing disability. And so unless we remediate that, we're going working on executive functioning, planning, organization, prioritization, time management is really just putting a Band-Aid on the problem. If our learner's not reading fluently, we can't work on executive function until we work on those foundational pieces, because all their cognitive energy is going toward reading. So when we look at this learner's Mindprint profile, we see that there's nothing in the upper 16th percentile, and only one piece that's in that high expected range. So again, we're looking at relative strengths. The relative strengths of this learner, her strong areas compared to her areas of challenge would be strengths in attention, working memory, and verbal reasoning, her low skills being that visual motor speed, which is also a processing speed indicator, and especially for this learner, we saw that, flexible thinking, and abstract reasoning. So whereas in our previous learner, we were really able to use those reasoning skills to support the other areas of challenge, in this learner, we actually see that it's the reasoning skills that are weak and are holding this learner back. So even though we're going to be working on specific reading interventions, we're going to have to work a lot more on comprehension with this learner because of the difficulties with abstract reasoning and flexible thinking. So we're still going to be using that Orton-Gillingham-based program because her reading level is low, her mechanical reading level is low, ability to decode, but also her ability to comprehend and her vocabulary is low. So we're going to also be working more on a reading comprehension program with a focus on mental representation, creating that mental imagery, something she is unable to do, unlike our previous learner. About a vocabulary building piece once we get some of that foundational reading in place and not before. For this learner, a writing program followed later again by executive functioning once we have some of those foundational skills in place. And cognitive integration techniques focused on processing speed, auditory memory, expressive language, and flexible thinking. Again, strategies become really important and things that this learner can utilize to help her strengthen those areas of challenge. So because her verbal memory and her verbal reasoning are a relative area of strength, that's with very simple language, but she has those pieces. She's able to do simple analogies. The vocabulary is simple, but the conceptualization is not. The ability to categorize language. We can use that to help this learner apply that foundational ability to higher levels of language, more difficult vocabulary. This is how we can grow this learner's ability to comprehend, understand, and ultimately to be able to write, which is the college required skill that kind of brings all of these things together. And this pause to take feedback, this learner actually has good attention, good ability to be able to stop and think. And so we want this learner to be able to use that as a strategy so that she doesn't answer impulsively, which is another coping strategy that a lot of our learners use and can be exacerbated in a classroom setting where they feel a lot of time pressure to answer quickly. We want this learner to have think time to think and pause, and to be able to take that feedback and synthesize it. So those are the case studies, and I believe now that we want to open it up for questions.
Thank you so much, Rachel. That was really thorough, and I'm sure all of us could have sat on for another 15 minutes listening to another case studies and just seeing how different these two students are, and really hearing the thoughtfulness in your intervention plan and how you're using strategies to support that student is so helpful. Vicki, do we have any questions in the Q&A that we'd like to answer live today?
Thanks for everyone who has contributed questions so far. I've done some answering in the Q&A, and I will, and I'm just going to look at ones that are coming in right now. In the meantime, Rachel, can you answer or talk a little bit about time frame for intervention and, like identifying an issue earlier? Is it a shorter timeline versus later in middle school or something? How does that change?
Yeah, that is a really great question. A lot of it depends on the student profile. If we're talking about the most common reason that a learner would have difficulty with reading, that profile is the dyslexia profile. It's not the only reason. There are other potential profiles that will struggle with reading, but it's the most common one that we see. So dyslexia occurs on a spectrum from mild to severe, so that definitely impacts the amount and time of intervention, depending on kind of where the learner is on that spectrum. Also, if there are comorbid conditions, so dyslexia plus ADHD, dyslexia plus an auditory processing disorder, or dyscalculia, or that more of one of those comprehension-based issues will also impact time in therapy. That said, generally speaking, the younger we get a learner, the faster we're able to remediate that learner through the process, and the more quickly they're able to kind of enter back into the general ed classroom and be able to start to synthesize that information, become an independent learner in the general ed classroom, because that really is the goal. When we get learners that are older, they're not going to be learning to read in the general ed classroom. Therefore, that work has of that setting, and it takes longer because they still have to keep up in the general ed classroom, right, with all of their other academic work. And so we apply accommodations while we're doing that remediation. So accommodations never become a replacement for the remediation, but they become a support to the learner so they can continue to get the content that's required while we work on these underlying skills. But typically, to go through an entire Orton-Gillingham program, it's going to take somewhere between 3 to 5 years of consistent intervention, 2 to 3 times a week, 50-minute sessions. And so we like to do longer periods of intervention, but consistently over time, for 2 reasons. One, we don't see regression. Whereas if we front load a bunch of this therapy into a year or something, a couple years down the road, we're seeing that learner has not been able to maintain the level of their skills. So that's one problem. But the other problem is that learners grow and develop over time. And so therefore, our approach to therapy is going to change as they learn and develop and grow, as the academic load increases. And so there's a lot of variables. Vicki, I know that's not a very clear and straightforward answer.
A lot of variables.
But yeah, they all need to be considered.
Yeah. Well, we've gone a few minutes over time, so I want to be respectful of everybody that's on this call today. And so before anybody else hops off and before we answer any more questions, I just want to thank Mary so much. Thank you for coming and being one of our panelists today. Thank you, Rachel, as well, and Nancy. And those of you that are attending, if you hopped on late, there will be a recording, and so that will be sent off to you as soon as we get that uploaded onto YouTube with a nice clean link. And if you have any further questions for Rachel specifically, or for Mary or Nancy, or Mindprint in general, the last slide on this recording will have contact information, so you'll be able to see that. In fact, I'll just go ahead and pull that up really quickly so that everybody can see that before you hop off. If you'd like to stay on, we've got about maybe 5 minutes max that we can take questions before our panelists need to leave and have other obligations. But thank you so much for joining us today in this webinar that's hosted and sponsored by Mindprint Learning. We hope that what we've brought to the table is a new perspective, a fresh perspective on how we're looking at challenging students who are challenged with reading, and shed some insightful new perspective on that. Mary, Rachel, if you have any other further comments before we hop into a couple other questions.
No, I want to thank everybody for joining today. And of course, and working with Rachel has been a great experience. Of course, those of us in schools know that the children are not always as severe, right? But I would underline, just as you said, that the sooner they get assistance, the better, the intervention.
Yeah. Thank you, Mary.
Thank you.
Thank you. And it's such a privilege to be working with this incredible team. And I'm so grateful to be able to really hear a school perspective. That's not my setting, but I love to be able to think about how we can better equip teachers to be able to do these processes in the classroom and just have more understanding of their learners. Because every teacher that I've ever met wants to help their students with everything that they have. And so the more tools that we can help you to have, the better, for sure.
Thank you so much. And with that, I think we're done with questions, Vicki.
Yeah, well, one quick one to clarify, the strategies page that I linked to is our bank of strategies, and they're learning strategies for students to help them learn more efficiently and effectively. And in the Mindprint profiles, students have personalized recommendations that sort of can connect that student to a specific bunch of strategies. So what Rachel was showing is strategies that are really best fit for that student based on their Mindprint profile.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, Vicki. Thank you, everybody. And we hope to see you next month. Next month, our focus will be on math and how to support all learners with math. So we hope you can join us. If you registered for today, you'll receive that link as well as part of the follow-up. Thank you all and have a great week. Thanks so much.